Announcement we have to do. One of my colleagues this morning will be passing around with a questionnaire. This questionnaire is very important, not to be flowery to tell us how good we are, but really to criticize us of things that you'd like us to improve in future conferences. Please put the hat of criticism, not of the hat of thank you. Your presence is a thank you. What we need from you is how we can improve so we can deliver better presentations in the future to you and to our colleagues in the Arab world. So I will ask John to pass this over. Another comments regarding the questionnaire, you don't need to give it to us right now, but we would like to receive them before lunch today. If we spend a few minutes just after the session, if we can get them before lunch today. Thank you very much. This second session of this morning will start with Andrew Young. Andrew, to few of you will know him as only Social Security, but to us he's a close friend, and I thank him being with us. Andrew?
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour for me to have this privilege to address you today. When I was first asked, I was a little nervous because I know remarkably little about the social security in this region. And I think it's important for all of us who come to deliver in a foreign country to be aware that our experience may not be directly relevant to you. So I look forward, once I finish today, to the questions which you will ask, which will put my talk in a context perhaps more relevant to you. I do hope, however, that one or two of my slides will be of a nature which will encourage debate about what I do think is an extremely important aspect of social security. As His Excellency the Minister said yesterday, and as George said earlier today, it's vital that we consider the medium and long-term financial implications of the promises we are making at present. Social security is vital to the economy of our countries and to the welfare of its citizens. And we must make sure that in all our roles, in management and administration, that we play our part to ensure it continues to be like that. I am not in any way an expert on the administration of Social Security, but I was fascinated this morning by Jamal's talk, which showed another side of the work and the importance that everyone involved in that attaches to doing it in a very professional manner and in a correct way, because people rely upon it. I do think that's the most important fact. People rely upon the security they will get from social insurance. They rely upon it if they are injured at work, and in particular, for us today, they rely upon it when they are no longer working. At that point in their lives, there is little they can do to improve their standard of living themselves. They rely upon the promises that have been made to them by their occupational plans, if they have one from their employer, or by their social insurance. And it's vital that these are run in a secure way. I am by no means a politician, and that's a very amateurish way to start. I'm a technical person, as it says here. I'm going to talk today about actuarial reviews. Some of you may have already received an actuarial review, perhaps one done by George, and I had some small involvement. It's very important that the people who receive these reviews understand them, understand the implications of them, understand the assumptions which underlie them, and I also think understand to some extent the weaknesses or the sensitivity analysis which you need to take into account. The fact that we cannot predict the future. What we can do is illustrate some possibilities in order for you to make your decisions. So today I'm going, if I can manage to get this to work, I will I intend to split my talk into 4 parts. The first part is the purpose of actuarial reviews. As I say, it's important that you understand their purpose. and don't misunderstand what we are trying to say. Secondly, I want to talk about the presentation of actuarial reviews. That's what's in the report you receive, so that you can understand it. Thirdly, to give some description of the assumptions, the work that we do in order to arrive at the assumptions, and what the input you can put into it, and what they mean. And finally, as you saw in the heading, I'm going to say something about international actuarial standards and the developments that are being made to ensure that the work we do for you, it can be relied upon, and the work that any other actuary may do can be similarly relied upon. So first of all, the purpose of actuarial reviews. It is to give advice. I think it's important to realize that's our role. We are not giving decisions, we are not giving instructions, we are giving advice. It is for the board or for the management of any social insurance institution to make the decisions based on that advice. We try to be as helpful as we possibly can, but you must always understand that it is within this restriction. We are advising and not telling. And the purpose of the advice is for you to plan your financial control of your systems, to make sure that it remains financially viable, not only in the short term, but also, and in particular from the actuarial point of view, from the long term, that it is financially sustainable. As I say, it's important that people can rely upon receiving the benefits in future which have been promised to them. If it looks as if a system will not be sustainable in future, then the whole purpose is completely undermined. And so it's important that people accept and understand that they will be able to receive these benefits in future, and you can convince them that you are running the system in an appropriate manner to ensure that will happen. And finally, and I think this is also an important one which is often omitted, it's important to look at the finances when any changes are made to a social insurance system. Because of its importance, there are many pressures upon the managers to improve social insurance systems. I can see in particular in Bahrain and in the other parts of this area where large funds have been built up by social insurance institutions. It is inevitable that pressure is placed upon those responsible for looking after the funds to improve benefits because the money is there, or to invest in a particular way because this is a very large fund which clearly can be used in many different investment mechanisms. But it is important that the people who receive the actuarial advice realize what their role is. Their role is to steward these funds for the purpose of the beneficiaries and to make sure that they do not promise too much. So whenever changes are made, it's important, I believe, that proper actuarial advice is obtained in the course, not only in the first year or the second year, but in the longer term. So the aim is to ensure that the policymakers have a sound basis for their decisions affecting the finances of the scheme. I would just like to repeat some of the things I said about the importance of actuarial reviews. There are many pieces of paper which cross the desks of those people responsible for social insurance. Sometimes actuarial reviews are very long, and you may be discouraged from reading them carefully. It's important that you realize the importance of that function, which normally happens once every 3 years or every 5 years. It's important that those people read them and understand them, because it's important that the contributors, people who are actually paying their money just now, often people who do not have a lot of money, that they know that their savings or their contributions will be properly looked after, and that eventually they will get the pensions they have been promised. And it's also important that the financial decisions you make take into account the long-term consequences. This is a very difficult thing for people to do. Most of our decisions now are made in the relatively short term. This particularly applies to politicians. And this is why, in particular, I think it's important for the board of any social insurance institute to focus on the long term, especially in the face of many pressures they will have for short-term alternatives. And that's the purpose. And now I want to have a look at some of the issues which are considered normally in actuarial reports, and which I want to consider today. Firstly is the presentation. I do think it's remarkably important that actuaries consider very carefully how they present the reports. This is a very complicated business, and there's no point in us doing a tremendously good, detailed, technical actuarial job if the reader is unable to understand it, or if the reader is unable to pick the important conclusions from what is likely to be a large amount of very interesting information. So it's important that the presentation, the presentation focuses on that. Around halfway through my presentation, I will show a couple of slides, and in many ways, those, I believe, encapsulate the conclusions. And it's important in a presentation that it's possible for people who are very busy and do not have a long time to deal with these issues, that they can understand the important conclusions, and they can understand what information is there for them to back their planning in future. Now, the review must also satisfy any legislative requirements. In many countries, actuaries have to carry out reviews for a particular purpose. Picking up one of the issues which was raised this morning, in the United Kingdom, the government actuary, that was Mr. Dakin who was here, has to prepare a report every year to the Parliament saying how the finances of the Social Insurance Fund will appear next year in the light of the changes which are proposed to the level of benefits or to the level of pensions, because they are increased each year, and also the extra contributions which will come in if any changes are made to contributions, and to compare the financial effect of that on the Social Insurance Fund to see whether the surplus remains satisfactory. This provides information to Parliament so they can take it into account in their consideration of the proposals. And notice too that this is a public document. Once it is in Parliament, everyone has access to it. Politicians, the newspapers, people who want to represent unions or represent employers. So it's fully public for people to consider and to make their own comments on. It therefore has to be understood by a very wide-ranging readership, and it's important that that is taken into account. Obviously, we must also satisfy the client's requirements. I have noticed in the reviews I have looked at in the Gulf area and in the Middle East that often part of an actual review involves a large number of suggested changes. It's very good to see that people are actively considering the financial position of their scheme and how they can improve it, but it's important that the actual review fully takes these into account and provides suitable advice. Nextly, it's important that the review makes clear any limitations or constraints. The limitations I will come to in some ways. For example, perhaps all the data is not available, or the constraints may be because there are certain instructions which have been made, assume certain changes will be made, for example. So it's important that the actuary sets out those decisions which he or she has not personally made, but which have been made by the people responsible for the Social Security system. It's also important, as I said, that it's readable by non-actuaries and readable by people afterwards, not just when they are thinking about the report, but maybe 2 or 3 years later, and they can put it in context. And finally, it's important in the review to set out whether it is being considered on a cash flow or a funded basis. My colleague George Saras will be talking later about funded pensions and the system which is used at some times for assessing the financial status of such pensions. I'm going to talk today about looking at them on a cash flow basis. Most Social Security reviews are carried out on that form. Most clients want to see what the income will be in future, what the expenditure will be, and where there is a fund, also to see the progress of that fund. So I'm going to talk about that aspect, and George will pick up on the other one. Now, the first detailed topic I want to consider is the period to be covered by actuarial reviews. I think it's important that they are done in as long a term as possible. In many countries, and in particular here in Bahrain and in other Gulf areas, the demographic changes are going to take a considerable number of future years to be fully phased in. The pension schemes are also relatively new, and it's important that that is also taken into account, that the longer term development of the pension system is seen. Many actuaries I have seen in the past have looked over perhaps 20 or 30 years for very good reasons. It is very difficult to project the long term. The uncertainties are inevitably enormous. But nevertheless, I do believe we must make the best attempt we can to look in the long term. Looking 30 years ahead here in Bahrain would tell you relatively little about the true costs of the promises you are making. And so it's vital you look 50, 60 years or 100 years. One of the other countries we are looking at just now, it's easily 100 years before the demographic position develops into what is likely to be the long-term one. In the Gulf area in general, there are very many children and relatively few pensioners. And it's important that we allow for the enormous changes which will take place before these pension systems are fully developed. Thirdly, to be just more specific, I like to look at least 60 years ahead. We know now, in general, the children who are born now and who will be 60 in 60 years' time and who will become pensioners. So we can make reasonable estimates for the level of expenditure on pensions over that period. There are uncertainties which we will come to, but that seems to me to be the minimum period. There are other uncertainties. Fertility will affect it before that time. But the main driving force behind the longer-term finances of your pension system is the development in the number of pensions and the change in the pensions they are entitled to. So I think 60 years is a reasonable starting point, and hopefully for longer. And so longer gets up to 100 years. And now if I can turn to the content of actuarial reports. The first topic, which I consider important, is to examine the data. I will come to a little bit more detail in a minute. We must make sure that we state whether the data is satisfactory, because the whole of the report relies upon satisfactory data. Secondly, the report must set out the assumptions which have been made. It's important that the reader understands exactly what has been assumed, because there are many possibilities. And so you need to have a proper understanding so that, for example, you may decide you like to make a different assumption and to try to assess what the effect of that might be. Thirdly, the actuary needs to set out the methods used so that someone can read the report and understand how the estimates have been made. It's very important, I think, that the users have a reasonable understanding of exactly how the answers were arrived at. Fourthly, you need to set out the implications of the results. I don't like to call them conclusions, because I feel that the conclusions are for the reader to make. From our point of view, I think we need to set out what all the implications are. That may cover the implications for the pensions which people will receive in future, if we make estimates of the average, for example, and also the implications for the fund itself, for the amount which you may have available to invest each year in future, or for the way the fund will start to run down at some point. So these are the kind of implications that must be included, of course. And finally, and most importantly, I think, we need to set out how reliable the results are. I don't mean to say the results are unreliable, but to give an indication of how the results would change if there is a change to some of the assumptions. So to return to the first of these topics, the data. Many types of data are used in actual reviews. Anyone who's been involved in one of the reviews and who's had to provide information to George or another actuary will know that there's an enormous amount of data collected, an enormous amount of data analysed. The first kind is normally data of a national nature, either on the economy, the history of the changes in earnings, the changes in employment, which can normally be obtained from national data, or the population information. Often an actual review will be based upon a projection of the population, and so we need information of that sort. Secondly, and perhaps more important to yourselves, is the information we receive from the administrative system. As Jamal said this morning, the administrative system is vital for many functions, one of which is the actuarial data which needs to be provided. I think it's very important that the system is set up in a way this can easily be provided. Inevitably, there are pressures on any administrative system and the development of one to get it done as quickly as possible and to minimize the amount of information which needs to be produced. But I think it's very important that the system automatically produces data which is available for actuarial reviews. It can often be extremely difficult to go back into the system and to extract the kind of information, the statistical information needed for actuarial reviews. And so it's very useful if you can set up your system, especially if you're developing it in any way that makes that much easier. And information is needed on contributions, on benefits, and we need information in detail. Sometimes we'll have information which is aggregated. You will collect it and add together all the people of the same age, or perhaps all men and women separately. It's also important in some cases to have individual information. Collecting not the details, the names of people, we don't want to know their personal details, but in order to have enough information and able to do the proper analysis for the scheme. The next type of information is accounting data. We need that for many reasons, but one particular one is to ensure that the administrative data we're using is reliable, so that we can check whether the amount of income, the amount of benefit expenditure are consistent with the detailed data we use for our review. So just to conclude on that one, it's very useful, and please can I make a plea again for you to have the data in a form suitable for extracting for actual reviews. And finally, and this is an important first stage in the actuarial analysis, it's important that the data is properly tested. Now, the next topic covered in the review will be the assumptions. Again, there are many different assumptions which have to be made. The first one is the demographic assumptions. That can be of several different types, which I will come to. Secondly, we have the economic assumptions. For example, the rate of return you might expect in future on the invested fund. Yesterday we heard a representative from Merrill Lynch talking about the complexity of the investment process in a pension fund. Many actual reviews simplify that to an extreme extent by making some assumptions about the rate of return and show a sensitivity analysis. There are also many other economic assumptions which have to be made. Thirdly, we have to make assumptions relating to the scheme itself. This will deal with for example, the increase in the pension which people accrue if they make one more year's contributions, the level of salary change which people have from one year to the next, which is a very important factor in deciding upon the level of pension which they will receive at retirement. And so there are many detailed assumptions which need to be made about the scheme. Now, in order to arrive at these assumptions, actuaries will carry out a detailed analysis of all the historical data which is provided on the information from the scheme, on the national data, and on all the economic data. The objective there is to look not only to see what the level has been recently, but also whether there are any trends. And when we look in more detail at some of the assumptions, I will consider what kind of trends might be expected. Because we must remember, as we all know, that the future will not be exactly the same as the past. So the analysis of the data is done to inform us, but not necessarily to give us the answer. It's important that actuaries consider whether the historical data needs to be adjusted in some way to take account for changes which are expected and to make allowance for them in the projections which they make. Now, it's often very useful to compare the features of a particular country with other countries as a guide to what might happen in future. For example, some countries have developed less demographically. Perhaps people aren't living as long as they are, say, in Sweden. And although there is an enormous difference between the countries, by looking at the experience of other countries, we can perhaps have some insight into the future possibilities. As His Excellency said yesterday, we need to look at the experience of other countries at times in order to learn from their mistakes. But we can also learn from the information which they have and how they can perhaps give us a preview of some aspects of the future. So to return to what is often considered the main assumption when people think of actuarial reviews, the demographic assumption. And in particular, I would like to focus on one, which is the future mortality. I have not got time today to go into all of the assumptions made in detail, and I'm using this rather to show the process of thinking which needs to be done in order to arrive at the assumptions to be made. As I said, first of all, you would of course analyse all the data which is available on the recent past. That will inevitably show that people have been living longer, that mortality rates are reducing at all ages, for young people and also for old people. This is one of the biggest changes which will affect the longer-term development of your pension systems. And it's vital that proper allowance is made for the likely changes in future of mortality. At the start of this century, very few people were living to, say, age 60 or 65, the typical age at which people receive pensions. Perhaps 50 years ago, half of the people in any country would live to age 55 or 60. And after that, they might live for 4 or 5 years on average. In the future, we can expect almost everyone, perhaps 90% of the population, to reach age 60 or 55 or 65, whichever the pension age is, a very high proportion of the people who work. And when they reach there, they will live for another 20 years or 25 years. A very big change, both from the position at present and the position in the past few years. And so this is a very, very important area that we need to pay careful attention to when setting the assumption. We need to make sure we make proper allowance for the improvements that can be expected in future. And the next point on mortality I would like to make is that we need to make particular allowance for the members of the scheme itself. In many countries, social security is a national system, so the mortality of the members of the system are very similar to the mortality of the population as a whole. But in some countries, and Bahrain, for example, the GOSI covers a subsection of the population. It's quite likely they have different characteristics to the population as a whole. So it's important that the particular mortality and the other aspects of the demographics for GOSI itself are examined and compared with the population as a whole in making the judgment about what assumptions to make in future. This will also apply to any smaller schemes any of you run. You may be doing it for a particular part of the population. For example, someone may run a scheme for doctors, and it's quite likely that doctors will have a better expectation of life than the population in general. It's also possible that you will not have enough information to use the data from the scheme itself to arrive at assumptions. So it's very dangerous in that position to say, I will use the data from the population as a whole. Account must be taken of the particular characteristics of the scheme that you are running wherever possible. And if it's not possible to do it in detail from the data, then every effort should be made perhaps to compare with some other country to see what the difference is there. Actuaries try to think in that way, to try to think, how can I arrive at my assumption in the best possible way to make my answers as reliable as possible. Now the next graph is just to illustrate how mortality has changed in the United Kingdom. I apologise for being very parochial in this, but I think you can expect to have very similar changes in any other country. I'll explain what this is because it's almost impossible, I suspect, to read it. The line at the bottom shows the percentage of people who live to the age along the bottom. So you have a white line for 1900, and that shows, if you look at the very left-hand side, that you start off with 100% of the population, and quite a lot died when they were children. And then there were relatively few deaths for the next 50 years or so. If you can see this little red dot, that will certainly make it better. A lot of people died here when they were children. 100 years ago, mortality rates of infants was very high. Then relatively few people died here, but still the numbers did fall until around this age, when we have a dramatic falling off in the population. So even here, we have only about half the population surviving to this age. Now if we go very quickly to the present time, and moving through the changes which have taken place over time, you see that very few people die at birth now, and very few even die until around age 40 or 50. We are now in the United Kingdom expecting the numbers to start dying off around this, and still to fall very steeply here. And as we move on into the future, we can expect this line to go further and further. Now there are very many uncertainties here, and this underlies one of the problems in making actuarial reviews. For example, is it possible that this point will move along to here? At some point in the future, there may be dramatic changes in medicine and in gene technology, for example, which will mean that significant numbers of people will live much higher. Experience over the last years has hardly changed this point. And maybe this is one of the big changes which could take place. Even if everybody lived to this age, we will only move this line along here. The really big change will be if this line moves here. Because these are the people here to whom we have to pay pensions. This is one of the big uncertainties. And I think I can say one of the reasons why it's important to have regular actuarial reviews, because we never know the future exactly. This, I think, will develop and change dramatically over the next 20 or 30 years in many countries. And so it's important we keep aware of this, because it will have a dramatic effect on the finances of our schemes. If I can show the next graph now. This one compares the trends in the expectation of life in different countries. And the particular point I want to make here really is that some years ago there was a wide disparity between the various countries listed. Most of them are European, Japan, the US. There are very great differences in the expectation of life for a variety of reasons. Countries have developed differently, social differences, health differences, economic differences. But it's amazing how they are all kind of homing in on a relatively narrow range. They're not all the same, but it's a very narrow range. And I think it's reasonable when we look at countries like some of the Gulf ones, where the expectations of life are lower than this, for at some point in the future for them also to trend towards the line that all these other countries are moving towards. This is the reason I say we can learn something from other foreign countries in their demographic development, because starting from here in a particular country, I think reasonable to assume in 40 years' time it will home in on the same target as these countries as they develop, as their medical systems change, as their water becomes cleaner. Lots of changes take place that enable people to improve their mortality. So that's the kind of data which I think actuaries would look at to come to a judgment on what might be a reasonable assumption. The next topic, another one of the demographic ones, is on fertility. I don't want to go into this one in so much detail, but just to highlight some of the points. In the long term, fertility is fundamental because it is the people at working age who provide the resources in one way or another for pensions. And the more people there are at working ages, the easier it is, in a sense, for the economy to provide for their pensioners. It still takes a long time for demographic changes to affect it, but you in Bahrain and in other Gulf countries are in a very advantageous position just now. You've had very high fertility rates, extremely high, and in many countries they still are relatively high. I would expect them to change in future, and it will be the point at which they develop too that will fundamentally determine the long-term finances. If you have a fertility rate of 2 children per woman, as is happening in many of the industrialized countries, then pensions become extremely expensive because you end up having roughly 2 workers, or 1 worker for every pensioner. If you have a fertility rate perhaps of 3, which may be a reasonable assumption for the longer term outlook in Arab countries, then it's more sustainable. But it's very difficult to project exactly what the long term will be. So it's important that actuaries take very careful account of the likely reduction in fertility in future, because this is a vital long-term factor. And now there are some other important demographic assumptions which I will just touch on. Some of them may not be so relevant for your own particular scheme. The first one I would like to mention is migration. I know that in GOSI, it is only Bahrainis who are members of GOSI, but in many countries, migrants can at least pay contributions when they are in the country, and they will perhaps get a refund of their contributions, or they will have some entitlement. And in small countries, migration can often be very large relative to the population. So often, migration changes can be important. As I said, the relative importance will depend upon whether non-nationals are eligible. It's also an important feature, which is the opposite of whether non-nationals are eligible, is whether people, if they leave Bahrain or another country, or they're out of the country when they are pensioners, if pensions will be paid to them. Because full allowance must be made, of course, for paying pensioners to people in foreign countries. And the final point I would make on migration is just how uncertain it is. It does not depend solely upon the economics and the social position in your own country, but also the economics and what is happening in other countries where migrants might come from. And so when actuaries have to make projections allowing for migration, this becomes a very, very uncertain part of the whole process. Similarly, if, for example, you were considering allowing migrants or non-nationals to become members, full members of your schemes, and not just for short-term benefits like injury benefits, if they're full members, then you would need to take very careful account of how that might affect the finances, as it would be a very fundamental change. Some of the other demographic assumptions are more detailed, and this often leads to problems over availability of data. So I've included it here just to show how detailed data is needed in order to make the actual estimates. Benefits will sometimes depend upon the marital status of individuals. Family benefits can be paid, benefits to widows or widowers or survivors, benefits to children, to parents. All of these can be very important, can be relatively expensive, for a pension scheme to provide, and it's vital that sufficient information is available for reasonably reliable estimates to be made. Sometimes this information is available from the administrative records of the scheme once it is fully developed. But in many countries, especially when the pension system is beginning, there is relatively little information on the members of the scheme itself. There are very few widows in many schemes, and so it's important that we have another source of data to enable us to make reasonable assumptions for these factors. And sometimes, of course, you may want to make changes to your scheme where there will be no data available from the scheme itself, and it's necessary to find other information, perhaps from national sources, which will enable a reasonable estimate to be made. Or alternatively, the actuary concerned may have carried out a similar review on a country with broadly similar characteristics, which will provide him or her with a reasonable basis for making estimates. So you need to be a little imaginative sometimes in arriving at some of these assumptions. Now that's the demographic assumptions. I would like now to turn to the economic assumptions, as we call them, which are vital in looking at the future finances. As I say, they are vital, but they are extremely difficult to predict. It's very difficult to be able to say what level of rate of investment return you'll be able to receive in 3 months' time, never mind 3 years or 30 years. Over the last few years, interest rates on deposits have fallen dramatically throughout the world, as inflation has changed in many countries. This has placed a strain on the rate of return which many pension arrangements have been able to obtain from their assets. It's very difficult to see the future, and it's important, therefore, if I repeat the points made at the beginning, that the users of actual reports have a proper understanding of the sensitivity of the results to the changes that can be made to these very important assumptions. In spite of them being important, we must include them, and so therefore it's vital that we show what the effect would be of getting a lower or a higher rate of return. Often this can have an enormous effect, and I expect George will talk about this a bit more in looking at funded schemes. The next type of economic information is on the members themselves, on the levels of salaries which people will receive in future. Contributions depend upon the level of salaries, and pensions depend upon the salaries close to retirement. So some assumption needs to be made about how that will change over time. And I put again at the end, the most important one, the investment return needs very, very careful consideration. In looking at the economic assumptions, as with the demographic ones, it's important to analyze available data, but it's particularly important to consider how the experience in the past few years may differ in future. I have seen many reports on people saying rates of return which have been received on investment in equities in the past 20 years in, for example, the United States have been extremely high. Therefore, we must invest more in equities in future. Now that may be true. I don't want to argue whether it's true or not here, but it's important to consider whether the past is really precisely a guide to the future, or whether perhaps there were reasons why the past 20 years were a bit different from what might be expected, and to take account of those changes in making these very, very critical assumptions. And that's the point I made here. And that's a point which is particularly important in the Gulf. As I say, you have very large funds where the fund will help to support the expenditure in future to a very large extent. And so this assumption can make a very critical difference to the sustainability and how long the pension fund is sustainable in future. And now to come to the third kind, I want to talk about some scheme-based assumptions. Again, this was a point which appeared in Peter's talk yesterday. It's very interesting how all the aspects link in together. The data, the investments, and the actuarial review. The point he raised was about early retirement, how actuaries make an assumption about the pattern of retirement, but we must allow for the possibility of that not being precisely seen in future. Some schemes may find that people retire earlier or later. This is particularly important for the schemes which I have looked at in this region. There are often options available for people to retire relatively early, which are very generous. And we make it part of our reports to make sure that we look in detail at that kind of option in order to make a proper assessment of the likely age at which people will retire. Because obviously if they retire early, they will receive a pension for longer and it will be more expensive. So we look to see how many people retire early on these generous terms. And I think this is a very, very important aspect of all of your schemes, irrespective of actuarial reviews, which you do need to look at carefully. People will tend to retire as soon as they can get the level of pension that they think is desirable. And if they can retire on generous terms, then they certainly will. And secondly, we look at the other types of options. People can buy more years of contribution. If that is relatively generous, if they will receive a pension which is good value for what they pay, then they will pay it. And that becomes a strain on the finances of the scheme. Someone has to pay for it, and it will have to be the other contributors. So we look at those kind of issues to see whether people will take advantage of them and allow for the financial effect of that. The third one is a minimum pension. If people can obtain a minimum pension for a relatively small number of contributions, then perhaps they will. I did a review for a completely different country, not in this region, where people were able to obtain a pension of a third of the minimum level if they paid contributions for 3 months. This was rather like Bahrain in one sense, in that there was a pension scheme for the private sector which had this feature, and also a pension scheme for people who worked in the public sector. And everyone left the public sector 3 months before they became 60. They all got a job in the private sector, paid contributions for 3 months, and became entitled to minimum pensions from the private sector for only 3 months' contributions. Now that seems very silly, and clearly is an option that should not be there. But it was there for a good reason. It was there so that when the scheme started, people were able to get a reasonable pension for relatively little contribution. And many of the options which are available in schemes were good ideas at the time they were made. But it's important to review them. It's important to see whether they continue to be important. For example, perhaps it's not so important now in some schemes for people to be able to buy extra years of contribution. Because as schemes develop, people will have more years of work in which they could have paid contributions naturally. Certainly, it's not so important that they are given a generous option to buy them. And so I think it's important we keep these options under review, and in the actual reviews we carry out, if there are particularly generous options, we regard it as our professional duty to point out the financial implications of them. And the conclusion is at the bottom. It's vital that any option like that is actuarially neutral. The fund should not lose or gain if people choose to do something where they are given a choice. And now the next important topic is presenting the results. I've referred to this in some way in passing, but it's important to show enough information that people can understand the vital features of the review. I think the first one is to show things about the numbers of people. I do think that many people understand this more easily than looking at the amounts. Or perhaps it's a good stage, a first step in understanding the amounts. It certainly is a good way of trying to understand why things change. So we like to include projections of the number of pensioners in future. In general, that shows a very rapid increase. And projections of the numbers of contributors, which perhaps shows some increase, but perhaps not so much. And perhaps at different times, so that people reading the report can get a feel for how the membership is changing and how the beneficiaries are changing. The second point, I think, which is important, is to show the amounts in terms which people can understand. Inflation is common in many countries, and amounts of money will increase very rapidly, even with quite small amounts of inflation, if you show the figures in inflated terms. I've seen some reports produced by computers with inflation of 6% for the next 100 years, where the figures at the bottom are all asterisks, because there was not enough space on the computer to show the size of the figures. And even before then, it's impossible for anyone to understand them. So the figures should be shown in current terms, without allowing for inflation. And all the other factors which are assumed should be in real terms as well, so that you can compare the future with the present and have some understanding of the relative size. And finally, I think it's best in setting out the report, it's a very simple point, to show projections of all the items which appear in the accounts. That enables the members of the scheme to be able to look at the accounts for each item and just to see how that is likely to change. And now coming into that in a little bit more detail, and moving on from the basic figures, I think it's important to compare the expenditure with the contributions, and I will show that in a minute. That enables people to very quickly see how the overall finances are changing in future. In particular, this will show, I think, for virtually every country I have visited, that even if at present the contributions are much greater than the expenditure, this will change very quickly, and it will show just how much the contributions will have to be increased. And thirdly, it's important to show the size of the fund, how much will be available to invest, what size the assets will be. And if I can just give an example of both of these now. The first point is the contributions. Can you take it back one, please? Right. This red line here shows the projected contributions for a typical scheme in this area, I think. There will be an increase in the contributions in the very short term. More people, more young people will start to work, and so contributions are very buoyant. They will start to level off in future if the number of children born becomes less than it is at present. But in general, contributions are very buoyant. We then have to compare them with the benefit expenditure. At present, benefit expenditure is much less than contribution income, and even in the next 10 or 15 years, still stays very much less. This is why I think it's very important to have long-term projections. It would be very easy to do a projection for 10 years and think, everything is absolutely perfect. We have lots of money, contributions are easily adequate, we've got lots of money to invest, we have no problems. And yet, at some point, and it will differ between different countries, this will change dramatically. And the benefits, in general, will exceed the contributions by very large amounts. So something will have to be done at some point. The precise change which schemes have to make in order to ensure that this disaster does not happen in the long term, the precise changes will depend upon the details of the scheme, but inevitably some changes will have to be made. The next slide shows the fund. If you can't see it here, it's in the copies which you have. The fund in red increases very rapidly over the short term because of the excess of contributions over current expenditure. It then reaches a peak in quite a long time in the future, 40, 50 years, maybe 60, maybe even longer. But at some point, the excess benefit expenditure does start to pull it down. The fund has to be used to pay for the pensions. And at that point, unless something is done, and indeed something has been done long before then, the fund will fall very quickly. It's amazing how much faster the fund falls than the time taken for it to rise. But that's because at this point there are very many pensioners and the excess becomes very large. And this is, to my mind, these two slides are the important conclusions which you are likely to have to look at, the important implications from any actuarial review you have carried out from your scheme. The exact time will depend upon the precise nature of your demographics, the precise nature of your scheme. But you will have a pattern like this. And it's important then to look at the impact on those two types of graphs of any changes which you want to make to try to improve the position in future. So you have a suggestion maybe to increase the contributions, and you can see what effect that has both on the contributions and on the fund which emerges. I think these are the two things you need to focus on. Now that's the end of the things I wanted to say about actual reviews. I would now like to say something very briefly only on the International Actuarial Association and the work which it's doing to try to introduce standards. There are some slides and some copies of slides in your pack. In many ways they repeat what I have said. The objective is to ensure that actuaries, all actuaries, carrying out this kind of work will produce a report that provides this kind of information in a reliable way. The aim is to make it a guide, especially for those actuaries who perhaps are working on their own. Maybe in one of your countries you will have an actuary in your social security system, and that actuary will have to carry out a review. It's a very big responsibility, and I think it's important that they are given some guide and some help from the international community of actuaries in order to carry out this work. And that's the underlying objective. I'm at present chairman of a committee, the Social Security Committee of the International Actuarial Association, and we are developing guidelines which will provide this kind of support. It will describe the data which actuaries should collect. It will describe how they should go about arriving at their assumptions. It will include items which I didn't mention when I was talking about the reviews we carry out, although we certainly do it, and that is carrying out discussions with the people responsible for the scheme to learn from you various pieces of information and various views on the future. We are not experts in the details of each and every scheme, and it's important that we learn and we discuss with the people who run the schemes. There will be guidance on the reports which actuaries have to do, how they should conduct the discussions with the sponsors of the schemes, with yourselves, to arrive at a final conclusion. And we hope that by doing this, you will have confidence in the work carried out by any actuaries, and you will have confidence in the results that they produce, so that you yourselves can make decisions on which these schemes can be based in future and can satisfy the needs of the people in the way which we are promising to do at present. Thank you very much.